Well, today we're going to be in John chapter 9, and as we conclude our Down and Out series today, maybe the idea of being cursed is a bit foreign, maybe it's a bit antiquated, maybe it's a bit old for us, but I promise you today, as we kind of bring this series to conclusion, that there's a lie that many of us believe. And it makes its way into a variety of settings in our life. And the lie really is that life is the best at the top of the ladder. We all kind of buy into this myth in a variety of ways. When I think about it, it happens to me every time I drive around Fairfield County and I look at other people's houses. And I think this is kind of the level that my house is on. But I go to certain neighbors and neighborhoods, it's oh, they're right here. I go to a few other places and it's right here. And then we drive by some places, they're oh my gosh, if we could just live there, it would be amazing, right? There's a belief that house, that neighborhood, that place is better. It happens with restaurants and stuff around here too. People will be I feel there are restaurants that if you say their names, it's a swear word. It's oh, you can't, oh. And you're oh, I guess there are restaurants that are here. And then there are others that are here. And then there are styles of food that are here. And then if you're a foodie, you're kind of up here a little bit, right? And then I think too, vacations, oh, where are you guys going on Memorial Day weekend? Oh, well, we're just going to be here in Fairfield, because it's we live on the beach. But, oh, no, well, we're going here. Then there's Europe, and I'm Bali, and then I'm the Caribbean. And it's oh my goodness, what is happening? I wish I was somewhere else. The beaches there are so much better than the beach here. It happens in parenting. Anybody? When it comes to kid behaviors or mommy blogs. I'm sometimes when I'm on Instagram, I'm oh my gosh, how do these people do it? I must be the worst parent ever because they're their kids are really well behaved and they all get good grades and all their kids are get along with each other all the time. And what is this? They eat vegetables. I just think we have these thoughts, right? That life is so much better at the top of the ladder. We begin to let all of our attention go up, 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 up. And we do it with God too, right? There are some people, they're just so close to God. Or there's some people who just have the perfect Christian life. And they're these other people that have never missed a Sunday of church ever. And we do this in a variety of ways. We think that life is the best at the top of the ladder. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little winded. But isn't that how we feel? Right? Climbing the ladder is exhausting. And here's the lie, is that all of our attention is drawn up to these people whose egos become bigger and whose voices become more influential. But at the top of the ladder, is the most fragile and anxious place to be. It literally up at the top gets more and more dangerous. Up at the top, risk gets riskier. Up at the top, you start to wonder, right? How long can I stay? How long can I live up here? What's going to happen to me? And what ultimately is happening is your world has gotten smaller. And you become much more anxious because the world you're living in is much more fragile. People at the top don't live the fullest life. People at the top live a very risky life, a very fragile and anxious life. They have everything to lose at the top of the ladder, and that's what has been happening as Jesus interacts with the people in John's gospel. In John chapter 9, verses 39 through 41, Jesus said, "For judgment I came into the world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." It's almost like saying, you guys have been looking at the wrong things all this time. You've been watching the wrong things. Your eyes are seeing things, but you're not seeing the system that you're really a part of. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things, and they said to Jesus, "Are we also blind?" Oh, clearly, we see clearly, right? Everybody thinks they see clearly. Are we blind? And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you'd have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." These merit-based up and in systems that we live in are counter to the mercy-based down and out system that Jesus initiates. The lie says that the fullest life is at the top of the ladder, But we all know that at the top of the ladder is the most fragile and anxious place to be. Jesus invites everyone down and out. And everyone has been seeing Jesus. That's what he says, for judgment I came into the world. You will look at me and you'll see what I'm doing. You'll see the very acts and presence of God. But many of you will choose to look away. Many of you will choose to look elsewhere. And so in John chapter 9, we come across what I'm calling today the mud mask miracle. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, said that as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. His disciples asked Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or that his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, because night is coming when no one will be able to work. And as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, Jesus spit on the ground and made mud with his saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so the man went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some said, it's he. And others said, no, it's one that looks like him. But the man kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, how then were your eyes opened? And the guy answered, he said, the man called Jesus, he made mud and he anointed my eyes. And he said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed and I received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? And the man said, I do not know. The story of the mud mask miracle, like all of these miracle signs that we've seen in John's gospel, are their discipleship lessons. They're teaching something. They began with the disciples asking a question as they passed somebody down and out. Here was a man who had been born blind, and the disciples look at him and they want to know, is this man cursed because of his own sin, like we talked about last week when we have a guilty verdict, when we're condemned, when we've done something outside the will of God? Is this man blind because of his own sin, or was it because of the sin of his parents, because he was born blind? They're trying to reconcile, maybe this is like one of those karma things, like did something happen somewhere else in a generation prior or in a past life that this man has been born cursed? Who is it that sinned, Jesus? And the disciples almost seem obsessed with this question, right? Like, we need to know the origin of this curse. We need to know why this man was born blind. And Jesus looks at him and he says in verse 3, he says, it's not that this man sinned or that his parents sinned, but it's that the works of God might be displayed in him. It's like Jesus is telling his disciples, and he's telling all of us today, that curses are not the origin, curses are not the center, and curses are not the ultimate point of your story. Have you ever thought about, like, this guy, if he could just, like, walk in here today and be like, hey, guys, my name's Joe, but I was the man born blind. You all know me by my curse. But I'm a guy. I have a name. I have a story that's so much bigger than who sinned, me or my parents. Curses are not the origin, they are not the center, and they are not the ultimate point of any person's story. The gospel begins with blessing. The gospel gives the means of a rescue out of all sin and curses, and the gospel promises the hope of a full restoration. There is no curse that cannot be overcome in Christ. There is no curse that cannot become overcome in Christ. Now, if you were around Christians for a long time, you might think that we share a similar sin and curse obsession with people. We are much more prone to speak curses than we are to speak blessings. And what Jesus does in the midst of this mud mask miracle is so beautiful. He takes clay, right? And he works the clay with his spit. I don't know what to make of that. If he did like a rinse first and did that and made it out, I don't know what he did with the mud and the spit. But I do know that in the book of Genesis, the hands of God fashion humanity in the clay. And I think John is wanting us to see this connection. This is a restoration work. This is a recreation work. This is God in the dirt healing somebody who is cursed. This is a recreation story because that's what Jesus is doing. He is recreating the world. And he tells the man to go and wash. Now, Jesus, we've seen this in other stories, right? He has the ability just to be like, poof, see. So why does he tell this guy to walk to a pool? It's a big pool. It's like 250 feet long. They've dug this up, right? It's like out kind of on the outskirts of the south side of the city. So he goes out to this big pool with these steps that go down into it, caked in mud. Who walked him there? This is a man born blind. You know, like, hey, make way. We got a mud mask guy coming through. This is spa treatment day with Jesus. I don't know what. His face is covered in spit-made mud, and he's got to walk to this pool to wash it off. But much like John is telling us a story that brings us back to Genesis, this seems very much like the Levitical priest stuff of like, there's a washing that's going to happen that's going to cleanse this man. Because curses are not the center of the point or the defining feature of our story. God has always made a way to recreate us, to make us clean. And then ultimately what's going to happen to this man is he's going to be restored into the community. He's going to become part of the community again. That's the story of the man who was born blind. But in the midst of this, there's a Pharisee lesson as well. In verses 13 through 34, you see that the people start wondering, like, how did this happen? What is the story here? And people start saying, hey, is it the man? Is he really the one that was born blind? Others are like, no, it's just a lookalike. It's probably not him because nobody who was born blind has ever received their sight again. It just doesn't happen. And so there's this investigation that happens with the neighbors, and the neighbors go to the local leaders. They start to send the question up the ladder. And they start to ask the authorities of the day, like, hey, is this legit? Is this really a miracle? Because if it is, then it's possible the Messiah is in our midst. But here's the problem once it starts moving up the ladder is that mercy, the mercy of Jesus, the mercy that's present in God, mercy has bent the rules, mercy has reversed the curse, and mercy is breaking the system. It tells us in these verses that the miracle happened on the Sabbath. Shoot, did Jesus forget his planner again? Was he not aware of what day of the week it was? He just, it's so crazy being Messiah. Got all this stuff going on. No, Jesus knew what day it was. When he bent down and he picked up the clay and he spit on it and he started working it, it says he kneaded it together, which if you follow again all these man-made rules, right, that have been layered on top of keeping the Sabbath, there are 39 categories of work. Kneading bread is one of them. Working a piece of dough is one of them. There's nothing in the law or the traditions of men specifically about working clay, but it's the same motion of work. And so they've got him on a technicality here. He broke the law. He broke Sabbath. I like to think of it as Jesus bending the rules. Like, he knows the heart of Sabbath. And he knows that God's heart is to restore the world, regardless of the day of the week. He knows that he can reverse the curse. And that's what they said. If he's not from God, nobody could do this. Nobody could do this kind of thing unless they were from God. It's never been heard before that someone born blind had that curse reversed. So either this man is a fraud, he's a lookalike, he was never really born blind, or this guy is from heaven and he's doing the work of God in our midst. But if that's true, then he's breaking the system. And we can't have a broken system. A broken system is a threat to those of us in power. And so you see that some people are born blind, but others refuse to see. Some are born blind, and others refuse to see. You hear it as they move from the investigation initially to a second round of interrogations. We need to make sure this is the man who was born blind. We need to call his parents. And his parents come in and they're like, yeah, that's our son. And yeah, he was born blind. Yeah, he's had that curse with him his whole life. But then it says this in verse 22, it says that they want the son to testify to the miracle for himself because they feared the Jews. The Jews had already agreed, those up the ladder had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, they were to be put out of the synagogue. Now, being put out of the synagogue may sound, like a minor thing to you and I because we join and drop clubs all the time. But being put out of the synagogue at that point meant being socially isolated. It would have been better to move towns and start over than to be put out of the synagogue and still be there. You would have been a total and utter outcast. And the parents were afraid because those up the ladder had said, if anybody confesses Jesus to be the Christ, they're going to be cast out. And in the midst of this interrogation, in verses 28 and 29, you see that the man comes forward and he testifies again. He says, yes, Jesus is the one who helped me to see. And then it says, he goes, do you guys want to become his disciples? Do you want to follow him too? And the guys, those up the ladder, those up and in, start reviling this man. And they said, we're disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. Now, let's just call time out here on these guys and present our own little challenge. How did they know that God spoke to Moses thousands of years before this was happening? Do they know that? Do they know that God revealed himself to Moses in the midst of a burning bush? That God had descended the glory of God on Mount Sinai and given Moses the law? Do they actually know that? We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he comes from. Sometimes knowing the past keeps us from seeing the present. We're so certain of things that we miss the very things God is doing in our midst. How did they know God spoke to Moses? They believed, based on the testimony of people and the works of God, that God had revealed himself and spoken to Moses. The very types of things God was doing in their midst through Jesus. They didn't know, they believed that God had spoken through Moses. They had put their faith in those historic acts. And Jesus has been saying this throughout John's gospel. If you knew Moses, if you knew the heart of Moses, if you knew the story of Moses, you would see that similar things are happening now. But once you're up a ladder, all your energy is expended in maintaining the ladder. It was terrifying to these guys to have their system broken and to lose their privilege, to lose their advantages. And so while there is no curse that Christ cannot overcome, the only curse that remains is the one you choose to maintain. Are you frustrated about money? It might be the ladder you're on. Are you obsessed with your physical health? Always disappointed in the way you look or feel? Might be the ladder you're on. Parenting, marriage, relationships, work. What is it in your life that feels like a curse? And now let's do the hard work of asking the question, has that curse fallen on me because I maintain it? I keep putting my attention on climbing the ladder. They choose their privilege over the presence of Christ. They'd rather have a cursed world of separation than belong to a blurred world of blessings. Because here's the thing, merit is going to keep you climbing the ladder. If you believe that everything in your life has to be earned, merit will keep you climbing the ladder, and you will keep living with the fragility and anxiety that comes with preserving and protecting your position and privilege on the ladder. You will live in that state if you choose to follow the merit-based systems that continue to tell you to move up and in, up and in, up and in. Merit climbs a ladder, but mercy built a cross. Jesus looked at all the ladders of the world and said, stop climbing. Stop doing damage. Stop being violent toward your soul. You were not meant for these merit-based systems. You were meant to live in the freedom that comes from the mercy of God. And once you eliminate the ladders from your life, you no longer are obsessed with climbing ladders. You start building bridges. You become a bridge builder rather than a ladder climber. But what these ladders do is they need to be protected. So we dig moats around ourselves, right? To keep all the down and out down and way out. And Jesus says, get off the ladder, enter the world, build a bridge. Heaven will come into your heart and it will connect you to other humans. So what about this guy, right? The man born blind. He testifies, says, Jesus is the one who helped me see. And you know what it gets him? Thrown out of the synagogue. So the story begins with the man as an outcast because he was blind. And the story moves to him being cast out because of who helped him see. He's in the same spot he was. Thanks, Jesus. Anybody been there? You put your faith in Jesus and you're like, thanks, Jesus. Here I am. Same spot I was before, but now I can see everybody looking down on me. It's so amazing to me. Jesus sends this guy off to the pool, and it's like we don't know if he's ever going to see Jesus again. He goes off and he washes, right? And then he goes through this whole sequence of him being investigated, interrogated. And then in verse 35, it says that Jesus heard that those up the ladder, those up and in, had cast him out. And Jesus found him. Jesus found him outcast again. And he asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Now remember, he was blind the last time he was with Jesus. I don't know how close they were, if he could recognize the smell of the saliva mud or what, but who is he? Who is he that I might believe in him? And Jesus said, you have seen him. It's he who is speaking to you. And in that moment, something between the auditory part of his brain and the visual part of his brain connects. And the voice that he heard instructing him to go to the pool and wash is now visually in front of him. On the back end of the miracle, his hearing and his vision come together. It's he, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And in verse 38, the man says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. If you want to get off the ladder and begin building bridges to fellow humans, our neighbors, people who are down and out, we have to understand the extent to which God loves us. God built a bridge from heaven to earth. There's a story in Luke chapter 7 where there's a woman, another one of these condemned women stories. And there's a meal happening at a Pharisee's house. And the Pharisee is all proud to be hosting Jesus. This is a great honor for him. And so he's got all his pomp and circumstance going. And there's this woman of the night, throwing herself at Jesus' feet and weeping over his feet and washing his feet with her hair. And Jesus tells this parable in the company there. He says, there's two people. One has a low debt and one has a high debt, and the master forgives both debts. Who do you think is going to be more grateful that their debt was forgiven? And the Pharisee, again, as the host of the event, was like, well, I guess the one with the greater debt. And then Jesus turns the story into what's happening right there. He says, do you see this woman here? Though she has sinned much, she is forgiven much. To the extent that you receive mercy, you extend mercy. We extend what we've received. And most of us are just passing the merit-based systems on to one another. We keep infecting each other with it. And the way we talk to each other, the way we interact with each other, the people that we hang out with. When we understand that God has overcome every curse, that's not the point of our story. It creates both a window and a mirror. The gospel is both a window and a mirror. The gospel is a window by which we now see the world. And right next to it, the gospel is a mirror by which we see into our own souls. And when you put those two things together, this is what most of us do, right? We either become so self-obsessed, we're always staring in the mirror, or become so others-obsessed that we're always looking out the window. And either way, we're always talking about everybody's curses. Either I'm the worst or everybody else is the worst. And Jesus says, no, let's bring them together. so that you understand that God, the same way God loves you, the same way God restores you, the same way God turns your curses into blessing, the same way that mercy overcomes all of your shortcomings, is the same type of mercy you're meant to extend out into the world. The gospel is both a window and a mirror. Do you see what God sees? Do you see what God sees in the mirror? And do you see what God sees through the window? And then maybe if you just think about Instagram for a second and you throw a filter over it, is what you're seeing filtered through the lens of curse or through the lens of blessing? Do you know how blessed you are? I don't mean that like you should be more grateful because you're so blessed. I mean like you are a beloved child of God and he looks upon you with delight and affection. If that's the case, then we can stop chasing up and in systems because the gospel creates a path through and beyond the curse of sin. We could say, like the man in this story, I was blind, but now I see. I see the way that God sees. I see a way through and beyond the curse of sin. The more we climb, the more our world reduces, but the more we move down and out, the more our world expands. I like to think of it this way, that those who are loved little, love little, and those who love little, live little. There's not a whole lot of life that can be lived on this much space. It's very restrictive. But if we would lay down the ladders, there's a whole lot of world to live in. The fullest life will be the product of the richest and broadest love. How many bridges can we build in Fairfield County? How many bridges can we build in Fairfield County? The fullest life is going to be the product of the broadest love. And that's the kind of love that God fills us with, that we might share it with others. Let's not be loved little, let's be loved much. And let's not love little, let's love much. Let's not live little. Let's live to the fullest.
Will you stand with us?